A man walked into the ocean on April 1st, 1876, but death came before he reached the water. Philipp Mainländer had already hanged himself hours earlier, using stacked copies of his newly published masterwork as the platform. He was 34 years old. His book argued that God had committed suicide and that we're all fragments of a divine corpse, slowly dissolving back into nothingness. Here's the strange part. He believed this was good news. The philosophy of redemption hit print just days before Mainlander's death. Some scholars call it the most radical pessimistic system ever written. Others won't touch it. The philosophy claims existence itself is a wound that only non-being can heal. Life has negative value. Death is salvation. The universe is God's scattered remains, and we're all moving toward blessed annihilation. This isn't abstract theory, detached from lived experience. Mainlander's grandfather killed himself at 33. His older brother did the same. His sister would follow years later. The family tree reads like a case study in inherited despair. Born October 5th, 1841, in Offenbach am Main, Philipp Batz arrived into a household already marked by violence. His mother's marriage began with rape. The youngest of 6 children, he grew up watching mental illness consume his family members one by one. Offenbach wasn't Berlin or Vienna. It was a market town near Frankfurt, practical and provincial. The Batz family ran a business. Philipp's father had plans for his youngest son, and those plans didn't include philosophy. They involved ledgers, trade, the respectable path of commerce. From 1848 to 1856, young Philipp attended the Realschule, learning what sons of merchants learned: mathematics, practical sciences, nothing that would lead to dangerous ideas. But 1856 changed things. His father sent him to commercial school in Dresden. The decision was strategic, calculated to turn the boy into a proper businessman. Philipp went because you obeyed your father in 1856. You didn't question, you learned double-entry bookkeeping and shipping routes and how to calculate profit margins. You became useful. The thing about forcing someone into a mold is that the pressure either shapes them or shatters something inside. For Mainländer, it did both. He learned the merchant's trade, he mastered the numbers, but something else was happening beneath the surface, something his father couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if he could. In 1857, Daniel Batz killed himself. Daniel was Philipp's older brother. The family said nothing useful about it afterward, the way families don't. Mental illness was something you whispered about or ignored entirely. Daniel became another name nobody mentioned at dinner, another confirmation that the Batz bloodline carried something dark and patient. Then came 1858, and with it, Italy. Naples wasn't supposed to change anything. Philipp was 17 when his father arranged employment at a trading house there. The assignment was practical. Learn international commerce, master Italian, make connections that would serve the family business. 5 years in Naples, then home to take his place in the Batz enterprise. Simple. Naples destroyed the plan completely. The city hit Mainländer like weather he'd never experienced. This was the kingdom of the two Sicilies, where Vesuvius loomed over everything, and the streets smelled of fish and lemons and the sea. The light was different. The air moved differently. People argued and laughed and lived with an intensity that made Offenbach feel like a tomb. He learned Italian quickly, the way you do when you're young and immersed and desperate to understand what's happening around you. The language opened doors. He read Dante and found the Inferno somehow beautiful. Petrarca's love sonnets made sense in ways German poetry never had. Boccaccio showed him that literature could be both moral and obscene. But Leopardi did something else entirely. Giacomo Leopardi had been dead for 20 years when Mainländer discovered his poetry. The Italian had written about suffering with a clarity that felt like recognition. Not the suffering of tragedy or melodrama, but the fundamental ache of consciousness itself. Being alive meant being aware of your own mortality. Awareness meant suffering. The math was simple and terrible. Mainländer read everything he could find. The poetry, the philosophical essays, the dialogues. Leopardi became the first voice that seemed to understand something essential about existence. Not that life was occasionally painful, But that pain was woven into the structure of being itself. You couldn't extract it without destroying the whole thing. The Italian years became something unexpected. Mainländer would later call them the happiest of his life, which tells you something about what came after. He worked during the day, handling shipping manifests and trade negotiations. But the evenings were his, he read. He walked through Naples as the sun set over the bay. He started writing poetry, terrible at first, then less terrible. February 1860 arrived without warning. Mainländer was 19. He'd been in Naples for 2 years. Someone, he never said who, gave him a copy of Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. He opened it, and something fundamental shifted. Years later, he described the experience as a penetrating revelation. He called February 1860 the most important month of his life. Schopenhauer had published the book in 1818, but it had taken decades to find an audience. By 1860, he was becoming famous, though he'd be dead in another 6 months. His philosophy was simple in structure and devastating in implication. The world we experience is representation, appearance, a veil thrown over something deeper. Behind everything is will, blind and purposeless, driving all existence forward without reason or goal. Life is suffering because will wants without end. It achieves nothing permanent. Every satisfaction is temporary, replaced immediately by new desire. We're puppets animated by a force that doesn't care about us. Consciousness is a curse because it lets us see this clearly without offering any escape except through art, asceticism, or death. Mainländer read this and recognized something, not just truth, but his truth. Schopenhauer had articulated what Leopardi had only approached. The problem wasn't society or politics or personal circumstances. The problem was existence itself. Being alive meant being trapped in a system designed to produce suffering. The only question was what to do about it. He kept working at the trading house. He kept reading Italian literature. But Schopenhauer had planted something that would grow slowly, patiently, until it consumed everything else. The philosophy wasn't just interesting or compelling, it was correct. And if it was correct, then everything else followed with logical necessity. 5 years in Naples passed like a dream that turns into something else partway through. The happiness was real. The Italian sun was real. The literature and the language and the sense of possibility were all real. But underneath, Schopenhauer's ideas were spreading like roots through soil, breaking apart whatever foundation Mainländer had built for himself. In 1863, he returned to Germany. 22 years old, fluent in Italian, trained in international commerce, and carrying a philosophical bomb in his head that would detonate slowly over the next 13 years. His father welcomed him back. The family business needed him. There was work to do, money to be made, a life to build. Mainländer came home and started writing. The poem was called Die letzten Hohenstaufen, the last Hohenstaufens. 3 parts, hundreds of lines, focusing on the final emperors of a dynasty that collapsed in the 13th century. The subject matter reveals everything about where his mind was going. Not triumph or glory or the heights of power, but decline and fall and the bitter end of great houses. The Hohenstaufen emperors had ruled the Holy Roman Empire. They'd fought popes and conquered kingdoms. Frederick II had been called Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. Then the dynasty ended in blood and failure. Their line extinguished, their ambitions turned to dust. Mainländer wrote about this with something approaching reverence. His father didn't understand. Poetry didn't earn money. The business needed attention. But Philipp kept writing, fitting it between ledgers and trade negotiations, staying up late with candles burning and ink staining his fingers. The poem wasn't very good. He'd realised this later, but it was necessary, the way bleeding is necessary when you've been cut. Then October 5th, 1865 arrived, his 24th birthday, and on that exact day, his mother died. The timing seems almost designed to wound. Birthdays are supposed to be celebrations, markers of life continuing. Instead, Mainländer got death, immediate and personal. His mother had been the stable presence in a family riddled with instability. She'd held things together while his father pushed and his siblings struggled, and the family history of suicide loomed over everything. Now she was gone, and something in Mainländer broke, or crystallized, or both. He stopped writing poetry. The shift was immediate and permanent. The last Hohenstaufens was finished, but felt suddenly pointless. Verse couldn't contain what needed to be said. What needed to be said required philosophy, system, rigorous thought pushed to its logical conclusions, regardless of where those conclusions led. He started studying, not casually but obsessively. Schopenhauer first and most deeply, then Kant, but approached through Schopenhauer's lens, avoiding what Mainländer saw as the distortions of German idealism. He read Fichte and Schelling and Hegel only to reject them. They'd poisoned Kant with their optimism and their grand systems that explained everything and meant nothing. He went back further, Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics, the medieval philosophers, Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, all the way to contemporary thinkers like Condillac. He was building something, accumulating materials for a structure whose final form he couldn't yet see clearly, but knew was coming. The family business continued around him. He worked because he had to, but the real work was happening in the hours between obligations, in the early mornings and late nights, when he could read and think and start assembling the pieces of what would become his philosophical system. Eschenbach's Parzival entered the mix. The medieval epic about the knight who seeks the Holy Grail seemed an odd choice alongside Schopenhauer and Kant, but Mainländer saw something in it, the quest for redemption, the suffering required to achieve it, the sense that the world was a test you could pass only by understanding its fundamental emptiness. By 1869, at 28 years old, Mainländer had a problem. The studying was finished, the system was forming in his mind, growing clearer and more complete. But he couldn't just write philosophy. He needed time and financial independence. He needed to not worry about the family business or earning his keep or anything except the work of thinking and writing. So he made a plan. In March 1869, he took a position at the banking house J. Mart Magnus in Berlin. The goal was explicit and practical. Make money quickly, invest it carefully, live off the interest, and dedicate himself to philosophy. 5 years, maybe less. Save aggressively, invest wisely, achieve financial independence, then disappear into his work. Berlin wasn't Naples. It was cold, inefficient, and expensive, but the banking world offered opportunities. Mainländer was good with numbers, understood commerce, could analyse investments. The plan was solid. By his early 30s, he'd be free. For 4 years, it worked. He saved. He invested. The portfolio grew. He could see the finish line. Just a little longer, and he'd have what he needed. Freedom to think without constraint. Time to write the system that was becoming clearer in his mind with each passing month. Then May 8th, 1873 arrived, and the Vienna Stock Exchange collapsed. The Wiener crack destroyed everything. The crash rippled across Europe, wiping out fortunes and ruining investors. Mainländer's careful savings vanished. 4 years of work, of patience, of calculated risk, gone in a matter of days. The financial independence he'd built so carefully turned out to be built on nothing at all. He resigned from the bank. No point staying. The plan was dead. At 32 years old, he had no money, no clear path forward, and a philosophical system burning in his mind that needed to be written before it consumed him entirely. What he did next makes sense only if you understand how desperate he'd become, how thoroughly the crash had destroyed not just his plans, but his sense of having any viable future. The philosophy was everything now. The only thing that mattered was getting it written down, before circumstances made that impossible. So in 1874, Mainländer did something that looks insane on the surface. He petitioned the emperor directly. Not through channels, not through the proper military bureaucracy. He wrote to Wilhelm I himself, asking for permission to enlist at 32 years old, well past the normal age for military service. The request was granted. Why the emperor approved it, we don't know. Maybe it was unusual enough to catch someone's attention. Maybe there was a quota to fill. Maybe nobody cared enough to reject it. What matters is that on October 1st, 1874, Philipp Mainländer became a cuirassier in Halberstadt. Think about what this means. A man who'd spent years studying philosophy, who'd worked in banking, who'd lived in Naples and Berlin, voluntarily entering military service. Not as an officer, as a regular soldier, subject to discipline, to orders, to the grinding routine of military life. In his own words, he wanted to be absolutely, in all things, submitted to another, to do the lowest work, to obey blindly. This isn't patriotism, this isn't career advancement, this is self-erasure, a deliberate attempt to obliterate his own will through submission to external authority. It fits perfectly with what he'd been reading. Schopenhauer argued that suffering came from the will's endless striving. The solution was to negate the will, to stop wanting, to achieve a state of willlessness. Military service offered a kind of forced meditation on exactly that. You don't think, you don't choose, you follow orders. But here's what nobody expected, least of all Mainländer himself. The months before he entered service turned into the most productive period of his life. June, July, August, September 1874. 4 months. He later described it as an enchanting life, a spiritual blossoming full of bliss and blissful shivers. The philosophical system that had been forming for years suddenly crystallized. Everything became clear. The pieces fit together. The structure he'd been building mentally was complete, and he wrote, furiously, obsessively. He had until September 28th. After that, he'd be in uniform, subject to military discipline, with no time or freedom for philosophical work. If he didn't finish, it would take 3 years to return to it. 3 years during which, as he put it, he'd be thrown into an abyss where the furies of a broken existence would inevitably have thrown him. The deadline wasn't artificial, it was existential. Finish now or lose everything. So he finished The Philosophy of Redemption, a complete systematic philosophy covering metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, physics, politics, over 600 pages in the first volume alone, written in 4 months under the pressure of an immovable deadline. He handed the manuscript to his sister Mina with instructions to find a publisher. Then he put on the king's coat and disappeared into military life. What was in that manuscript? What had he been building toward all these years? The core idea is almost too simple to believe. God existed, past tense. God was a unified, simple, perfect being, outside space and time. And God committed suicide. Why would God kill himself? Because existence, even for God, was unbearable. Being itself was suffering. Unity was a prison. The only escape was self-destruction. But God couldn't just die, not as a unified being. Death requires time, requires process, requires the passage from being to non-being. None of that exists outside space-time. So God shattered himself, exploded into multiplicity, became the universe. Every atom, every particle, every living thing is a fragment of God's corpse. The Big Bang wasn't creation, it was divine suicide. The universe is God's shattered remains, slowly decaying toward absolute nothingness. This sounds like mysticism or poetry. It's not. Mainländer structured it as rigorous philosophy, building arguments, citing evidence, responding to objections. He took Schopenhauer's concept of the will as the fundamental reality and pushed it to its logical extreme. Schopenhauer said there was one universal will that manifested in all things. Mainländer said no, that unity is already broken. Each individual has their own will. Each fragment of God's shattered being maintains individual existence, and each individual will is fundamentally a will to die. Schopenhauer called it the will to live, the endless striving that causes suffering. Mainländer inverted it. The will is already oriented toward death. Life is just the slow process of getting there. Every action, every desire, every moment of existence is actually the will working toward its own extinction. We want things because wanting keeps us distracted from the fundamental truth that we're dying and that dying is what we actually want. The will to live is the will to die disguised from itself. Redemption, then, isn't escaping suffering. It's completing the death that began with God's suicide. Every death, every extinction, every moment of cessation brings the universe closer to the final state, absolute nothingness, complete non-being. This is where Mainländer breaks from Schopenhauer most dramatically. For Schopenhauer, when you negate your will, you achieve a kind of relative nothingness. You still exist, but without desire. It's peaceful, but not final. For Mainländer, death is absolute. When you die, you're done. No rebirth, no continuation, no cosmic will persisting. You achieve genuine nothingness. This makes death not just acceptable, but desirable, not in a depressive or nihilistic sense. In a logical, philosophical sense, if existence is suffering and non-existence is peace, then death is liberation. The universe itself is moving toward this liberation. Everything that exists is working, consciously or not, toward its own cessation. But Mainländer wasn't advocating mass suicide. Not exactly. His ethics are more complicated than that. He argued that while death is ultimately good, the path there matters. You can't just opt out immediately. There are duties, social obligations, the work of making sure everyone has the opportunity to understand the truth about existence. Once you know that life is suffering and death is redemption, you have a responsibility to help others reach that understanding. This is where his social conscience enters. Unlike Schopenhauer, who was basically a misanthrope, Mainländer cared deeply about poverty, injustice, and working-class suffering. He saw that most people couldn't even begin to contemplate philosophical questions because they were too busy surviving. His ethics demanded creating social conditions where everyone could access education, develop consciousness, and eventually choose death knowingly rather than having it forced on them by circumstance. It's pessimism with a social program. The goal is universal extinction, but you have to build a just society first so that everyone can approach extinction freely and consciously. During his year in military service, Mainländer lived this philosophy in practice. Drill, orders, physical exhaustion, the complete submission of individual will to external authority. It was exactly what he'd wanted. A laboratory for testing whether the will could be negated through discipline. But the body broke faster than expected. By November 1875, just over a year after enlisting, he was released early. Officially, his service was complete. Unofficially, he was exhausted. Ineffably tired was how he described it to Minna. Physically healthy, but mentally and emotionally spent. He returned to Offenbach. The manuscript was with publishers. The first volume was being prepared for print. And Mainländer, instead of resting, entered another period of manic productivity. 2 months. November and December 1875. In that time, he corrected the proofs for the first volume, wrote his memoirs, composed a novella called Rupertine Delfino, and completed the entire second volume of The Philosophy of Redemption, another 650 pages of philosophical essays. The novella is worth noting because it shows how the philosophy translated into fiction. Rupertine Delfino is about characters caught between wanting to live and wanting to die. They understand intellectually that death is redemption, but can't quite bring themselves to embrace it. The novella doesn't resolve this tension, it just presents it, shows people trapped between philosophical insight and biological instinct. The second volume of the main work expanded on themes from the first, detailed explorations of ethics, aesthetics, politics, applications of the central metaphysics to specific domains. It's systematic philosophy in the grand tradition, every question addressed, every objection anticipated. By early 1876, the work was complete. Everything he'd set out to do was done. The philosophy was written, published, released into the world. And then the question that had been hovering in the background moved to the foreground. What now? Mainländer began to doubt whether his life still had value. The philosophy was finished. What duties remained? He considered political activism. Social democracy was gaining strength in Germany. The workers' movement needed intellectuals, organisers, voices. Maybe he could contribute there, help accelerate society toward the final state his philosophy predicted. He wrote down addresses to workers' groups, drafted letters, made plans, but nothing came of it. The energy wasn't there, or the conviction. Or maybe he knew that political organising wasn't really what he wanted. In letters to Minna, he expressed the uncertainty directly. Should he seek death now that his work was complete? Or should he continue living to spread the philosophy, to help build the social conditions that would allow universal redemption? One letter captures the tension perfectly. If I am not to seek death with pleasure, after this fruit has ripened, lacking any motive, I must enter into the realm of social democracy, which will allow me to become exhausted and dazed, so as not to listen to the seductive voices of this longing for absolute rest. He knew what he wanted: rest, non-being, the redemption his philosophy promised. But he wasn't sure whether wanting it was enough justification, whether he'd fulfilled his obligations to others, whether dying now would be philosophical consistency or selfish abandonment. The first volume of The Philosophy of Redemption was published in late March 1876. Mainländer was 34 years old. He'd spent 15 years building toward this moment. The book existed. His system was public. Anyone who wanted could read it, understand it, accept or reject it. On the night of April 1st, 1876, in his apartment in Offenbach, Philipp Mainländer hanged himself. The details are disputed. Some accounts say he stacked copies of his newly published book and used them as a platform. Others say that's apocryphal, a dramatic flourish added later. What's certain is the date, the method, and the timing. Days after publication, before any reviews or responses, before knowing whether anyone would read or care about what he'd written. Was it philosophical suicide? The final act of a man living consistently with his stated beliefs? Or was it breakdown? The collapse of someone who'd pushed too hard for too long and finally exhausted every reserve? Both. The answer has to be both. You can't separate the philosophy from the psychology, from the exhaustion, from the conviction. They're all tangled together. The beliefs were genuine. The mental state was deteriorating. The exhaustion was real. The logic was consistent with everything he'd argued. He believed non-being was better than being. He'd completed his philosophical work. The duties he felt toward humanity were fulfilled. Logically, death was the next step. But logic doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a mind and body that had been stretched to breaking. His sister, Minna, found him. She'd been his closest ally, his supporter, the one who'd helped find publishers and manage the practical details while he focused on philosophy. Now she had to manage his death, arrange the burial, deal with the aftermath, and eventually compile and publish the second volume he'd left behind. The funeral was small, Offenbach Cemetery, a grave that still exists but is rarely visited. The death itself generated little immediate attention. A young philosopher nobody had heard of, a book that hadn't been reviewed, a life that seemed, from the outside, to have ended in failure and obscurity. But the book survived. The philosophy didn't die with its author. And what happened next? The strange afterlife of Mainländer's ideas would prove more complex and more influential than anyone standing at that grave in 1876 could possibly have imagined. The book sat on shelves in a handful of German bookstores. Philosophy of Redemption by Philipp Mainländer. Nobody knew who Mainländer was. The name itself was a pseudonym, deliberately chosen to obscure identity. And the few people who picked up the book found something almost incomprehensible in its ambition and darkness. This was 1876. Germany was still processing Schopenhauer, whose pessimism had only gained wide recognition after his death in 1860. Now here was someone pushing that pessimism to conclusions Schopenhauer himself had avoided. Not just that life is suffering, but that existence itself is a cosmic mistake. Not just that we should minimize desire, but that we should actively work toward non-being. The initial reception was silence. Not rejection exactly, just absence. No major reviews appeared. No philosophical journals took notice. The book existed, but it didn't register. Part of this was timing. German philosophy in the 1870s was dominated by other concerns. Neo-Kantianism was ascendant. Materialism and positivism were gaining ground. Pessimism was seen as a phase, something interesting but ultimately sterile. A dead end rather than a beginning. Part of it was presentation. The book was dense, systematic, uncompromising. Mainländer didn't write for popularity. He wrote to be complete, to work out every implication of his system, regardless of how disturbing those implications became. The result was a text that demanded serious engagement and offered no easy way in, and part of it was simple bad luck. Books need advocates. They need someone with influence to notice them, recommend them, create conversation around them. Mainländer died before that could happen, without an author to promote the work, without a living presence to defend and explain it. The book simply sat. But Mjolnir remained. His sister, who'd supported him throughout, now became the guardian of his legacy. She had the second volume. 650 pages of philosophical essays he'd completed in those final months. Essays on physics, on ethics, on aesthetics, on politics, the full elaboration of a system the first volume had only outlined. Publishing it became her mission. Not immediately. The shock of his death, the practical matters of settling his affairs, these took time. But by the early 1880s, she was actively seeking a publisher for the second volume, explaining what it contained, arguing for its importance, trying to generate interest in a philosopher nobody remembered. She succeeded in 1886. 10 years after Mainländer's death, the second volume of Philosophy of Redemption appeared. It received slightly more attention than the first, partly because pessimistic philosophy had gained more acceptance by then, partly because Mina's persistence had created some awareness of the first volume. Reviews appeared, most were dismissive. The pessimism was too extreme, the conclusions too disturbing. One critic called it philosophical nihilism, dressed up as cosmic redemption. Another suggested that Mainländer's suicide proved the philosophy was dangerous rather than true. But some readers responded differently. They found in Mainländer something they'd been looking for without knowing it. A philosophical system that didn't flinch, didn't pull back, didn't offer false comfort. One that followed its premises to their logical end regardless of where that led. These early admirers were scattered, isolated. A student in Munich who copied passages into notebooks. An artist in Vienna who found the cosmology bizarrely compelling. A doctor in Hamburg who saw in the philosophy a way to make sense of suffering he witnessed daily. They didn't form a movement or a school. They were individuals who'd stumbled onto something that resonated. The first significant intellectual to engage seriously with Mainländer was Eduard von Hartmann, whose own philosophy of the unconscious had made pessimism fashionable in the 1870s. Hartmann's pessimism was gentler than Mainländer's, more accommodating to ordinary life. But he recognized in the younger philosopher's work a rigorous extension of principles he himself had explored. Hartmann wrote about Mainländer, not endorsing his conclusions, but acknowledging their logical force. If you accept certain premises about the nature of will and existence, Hartmann argued, Mainländer's system follows with disturbing inevitability. You might reject the premises, but you can't dismiss the reasoning. This brought more attention. Philosophy journals began discussing Mainländer. Comparisons were made to Schopenhauer, to Leopardi, to Buddhist thought. The question emerged, was this philosophy original or merely derivative? Was Mainländer adding something new, or just pushing existing ideas further? The answer depends on what you mean by original. Mainlander's metaphysics borrowed heavily from Schopenhauer. The basic framework of will, representation, suffering, these were inherited, but the cosmology was genuinely new. The idea that God had committed suicide, that the universe is the fragmenting corpse of a dead deity, that redemption means assisting in the final dissolution of all being. This was unprecedented in Western philosophy. So was the social dimension. Schopenhauer's pessimism was aristocratic, individualistic. It offered a path for rare individuals to escape suffering through aesthetic contemplation or ascetic denial. The masses were left to their misery. Mainlander rejected this. His philosophy included everyone. Redemption wasn't for the few who could achieve enlightenment. It was the cosmic destiny of all existence. This universal scope connected to his political concerns. If suffering is universal and redemption possible, then social conditions matter enormously. Systems that increase suffering or prevent people from recognizing the nature of existence are obstacles to redemption. This led Mainlander to critique economic inequality, to sympathize with workers' movements, to argue for education and social reform. These political implications attracted a different kind of reader, socialists and anarchists who found in pessimistic philosophy unexpected support for revolutionary action. If existence itself is the problem, then incremental reform isn't enough. The entire structure needs transformation. Not toward utopia, Mainlander would never promise that, but toward conditions where universal redemption becomes possible. This political reading gained momentum in the 1890s. Minna published selections from her brother's letters and notes, including his thoughts about joining the social democratic movement. These showed a philosopher wrestling with how to act on his beliefs, whether pure theory was sufficient or whether ethical commitment demanded practical engagement. Some readers saw this as inconsistency, others saw it as the deepest honesty. Mainlander never resolved the tension between his philosophy's ultimate conclusions and his sense of obligation to others. He died before working it out. That unresolved tension became part of the philosophy's appeal, making it more human than perfectly systematic thought could be. Meanwhile, a strange parallel development was occurring. Nietzsche, whose own philosophy was becoming increasingly influential, had encountered Mainlander's work. We know this from letters and notes. Nietzsche never wrote extensively about Mainlander, but traces appear throughout his mature philosophy. The relationship is complex because Nietzsche's project was essentially anti-Mainlander. Where Mainlander saw cosmic death drive, Nietzsche insisted on will to power. Where Mainlander advocated acceptance of decay, Nietzsche demanded affirmation of life. Where Mainlander offered redemption through non-being, Nietzsche proposed eternal return. But these aren't just contradictions, they're responses. Nietzsche understood Mainlander's philosophy well enough to see it as the ultimate expression of pessimism's logic. Everything Nietzsche wrote about overcoming nihilism, about creating values, about amor fati, can be read as arguments against positions Mainlander had staked out. This makes Mainlander important even to people who reject his conclusions. He represents the endpoint of one philosophical trajectory, the place you reach if you start with certain premises about suffering and will and follow them without compromise. Nietzsche's alternative philosophy gains force from the clarity of what it opposes. By the turn of the century, Mainlander had achieved a strange status, still obscure to general readers, but known and discussed among philosophers and intellectuals interested in pessimism. Not influential in the sense of creating a school, but present as a reference point. The philosopher who went furthest, who didn't stop where others hesitated. Artists began discovering him. Alfred Kubin, whose grotesque drawings explored darkness and decay, found in Philosophy of Redemption a perfect articulation of his own intuitions. He called it the consolation of my life and death. The phrase captures something crucial about how the philosophy functioned for certain readers. It wasn't depressing. It was consoling, not despite its darkness, but because of it. Why would cosmic pessimism console? Because it validates experience. If you felt that existence is fundamentally wrong, that suffering isn't accidental but essential, that the world shouldn't be this way, Mainländer tells you you're right. You're not crazy or weak or ungrateful. You've seen clearly. The problem isn't you, it's being itself. This validation mattered enormously to people living with depression, chronic pain, existential despair. Mainländer didn't promise things would get better. He promised that your perception of how bad things are is accurate. That's a different kind of comfort, but for some people it's more valuable than false hope. The philosophy also travelled beyond Germany. French translations appeared in the early 1900s. Partial translations into other languages followed. The ideas spread, though often attributed incorrectly or filtered through other thinkers. People encountered Mainländer's concepts without necessarily knowing the source. In Japan, the writer Akutagawa Ryunosuke found Mainländer's work in translation and was profoundly affected. He wrote about it directly, noting how it had become deeply ingrained in my consciousness. His novel Kappa contains clear Mainländer influences. The sense of existence as burden, the attraction to non-being, these themes pervade Akutagawa's later work. This international reception revealed something about the philosophy's scope. The specific German context mattered, but the core ideas transcended cultural boundaries. Suffering is universal. The question of existence's value is universal. Mainländer's answers might be extreme, but the questions resonated across cultures. The First World War changed how people read Mainländer. Suddenly, cosmic pessimism didn't seem abstract. Millions dead in trenches, civilization revealed as thin veneer over barbarism, progress shown to be illusion, the world Mainländer described, where existence was fundamentally wrong and suffering intrinsic, looked less like philosophical speculation and more like accurate description. Post-war German intellectuals returned to pessimistic philosophy with new urgency. Spengler's Decline of the West echoed Mainländer's cosmology of decay. Existentialism's confrontation with absurdity revisited questions Mainländer had explored. The sense that something was fundamentally broken in reality itself became widespread. Mainländer's specific system remained too extreme for mainstream acceptance. But his diagnosis, his sense that existence was the problem rather than any particular social arrangement, gained traction. You couldn't fix this with better politics or improved conditions. The wrongness went deeper. This is where Minna's work becomes tragic. She'd spent decades preserving and promoting her brother's philosophy, publishing the second volume, collecting his papers, writing memoirs, trying to ensure his ideas survived. And they had survived. The books remained in print, people read them, ideas spread. But in 1891, 15 years after Philipp's death, Minna killed herself. The same method, the same deliberate choice. Whether this was philosophical commitment or family curse or psychological collapse, we can't know. Probably all three, inseparably tangled. Her death added another layer to the Mainländer story. Now, it wasn't just the philosopher who died by suicide after publishing his work. It was the philosopher and his sister who dedicated herself to preserving that work. The family pattern continued. The philosophy seemed to carry its own dark weight. Critics used this to dismiss Mainländer. See what happens when you take these ideas seriously? Death. The philosophy doesn't lead to wisdom or peace. It leads to suicide. Therefore, it must be false, dangerous, something to be avoided. But that argument assumes philosophy should make you happy. That truth should be comforting, that ideas are only valuable if they promote life. Mainländer would have rejected all these assumptions. If the truth is dark, denying it doesn't make it less true. It just makes you deluded. The question his philosophy poses isn't whether accepting it makes you happy. The question is whether it's accurate, whether reality actually is the way Mainländer describes it. A fragmenting unity, a cosmic death drive, existence as mistake. If that's true, then we should acknowledge it regardless of psychological consequences. This is why the philosophy remains disturbing more than a century later. It doesn't offer escape clauses. It doesn't say, this is terrible, but here's how to cope. It says, this is terrible, and stops there. The only redemption is ending. The only solution is non-being. Everything else is delay. The modern reader encounters a fundamental problem with Mainlander's philosophy. It sounds insane. A universe born from God's suicide, existence as cosmic mistake, death as salvation. These claims don't fit our framework for understanding reality. We're trained to dismiss such ideas as religious mysticism or depressive delusion. But Mainlander wasn't mystical. He was methodical. The philosophy of redemption is structured like a scientific treatise, building arguments step by step, addressing objections, providing evidence. He approached metaphysics the way a physicist approaches matter. What are the fundamental constituents of reality? What laws govern their behaviour? Where is everything heading? His answers were dark, but his method was rigorous. Start with consciousness. You experience yourself as separate from others. Your pain is yours alone. Your death will be your end, not the world's end. This seems obvious, but it contradicts Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Schopenhauer argued for a single cosmic will underlying all phenomena. Your individual will is just one manifestation of this universal force. When you die, the will continues in other forms. Nothing is truly destroyed, only transformed. Mainlander rejected this completely. If we were all manifestations of one will, your suffering would be my suffering, but it's not. When you die, something genuinely ends. Your individual consciousness ceases absolutely. There's no cosmic recycling, no reincarnation, no continuation in different form. This revision seems small but changes everything. If individual wills are genuinely separate, then individual deaths are genuinely final. You can actually escape existence rather than being endlessly recycled through it. Schopenhauer's universe was a prison with no exit. Mainlander's universe was a prison with billions of individual escape routes. This makes suicide philosophically coherent, in a way it wasn't for Schopenhauer. If death means absolute cessation, if your individual will can be permanently silenced, then death becomes salvation rather than transition. Now add the cosmological dimension. Why do individual wills exist at all? Where did they come from? Mainlander's answer: God's fragmentation. Before time, before space, before matter, there was simple unity. Perfect, unchanging, eternal. This unity possessed consciousness, but no experience. It existed outside time, meaning it couldn't change, couldn't act, couldn't become anything other than what it already was. This state was unbearable, eternal existence with no possibility of non-existence, the ultimate prison. The only escape was self-destruction. But how does a timeless, spaceless unity destroy itself? By shattering into multiplicity, by becoming the universe. The Big Bang wasn't creation, it was divine suicide. Every particle, every force, every conscious being is a fragment of that original unity. We're all pieces of God's corpse, slowly decaying toward final nothingness. This explains why existence feels wrong. It is wrong. We're not supposed to be here. Our existence is the result of a cosmic catastrophe, a divine death that's still unfolding. The universe's expansion, entropy's increase, the heat death predicted by physics. These aren't neutral facts about matter's behavior. They're the continuing process of God's dissolution. Everything is moving toward absolute zero, toward final silence, toward the non-being that was God's goal from the beginning. Human consciousness is particularly important in this process. We're not just fragments decaying passively. We can actively participate in the cosmic death drive. We can choose to end our individual wills, speeding the universe toward its final state. This is where the ethics become clear. The supreme moral principle is recognizing that non-being is better than being. Once you understand this, your actions should align with it. You should minimize suffering, your own and others. You should reduce the amount of will in existence. Ultimately, you should embrace death. But here's where Mainländer parts from simple nihilism. He doesn't say existence is meaningless. He says it has one meaning: to end. That's not the same as having no meaning. A fire exists to burn itself out. It's not meaningless. It has a clear purpose and direction. The fire's meaning is its own exhaustion. Existence is similar. We exist to cease existing. The universe has directionality, purpose, goal. That goal happens to be nothingness, but it's still a goal. This gives life a strange kind of dignity. You're participating in something cosmically significant. Your death isn't a private tragedy. It's a contribution to the universe's fundamental project. Orthodox Christianity promises resurrection. Buddhism promises nirvana after many lifetimes. Schopenhauer offers escape for rare saints. Mainländer offers something more democratic. Everyone gets out. Everyone achieves redemption, just by dying. The physics troubled some readers. How literally should we take the God-suicide story? Mainländer insisted it was metaphysical truth, not poetic metaphor. God genuinely existed as primordial unity. The universe genuinely resulted from his self-destruction. But the details get fuzzy. What does it mean for something to exist outside time and space? How can a timeless being make a decision? Decisions require before and after. They require time. Mainländer never adequately resolved these issues. His cosmology functions more as mythology than physics. It provides a narrative frame for his pessimism, explaining why existence feels like a mistake. Because it is one. The ethical implications extend beyond individual suicide. Mainländer argued for social reform, not because he believed in progress or human perfectibility. He didn't. But reducing suffering mattered as a moral imperative. Workers living in poverty, their lives consumed by brutal labour. This was wrong not because it prevented them from flourishing. Flourishing was impossible. It was wrong because it added unnecessary suffering to existence's inherent suffering. Improve conditions not to make life good, which is impossible, but to make it less terrible. Reduce pain not as path to happiness, but as harm reduction while we wait for death. This distinguishes Mainländer from quietistic pessimism. Schopenhauer advocated withdrawal from the world, ascetic renunciation. Stop wanting things. Stop trying to change conditions. Accept suffering as inevitable. Mainländer found this inadequate. Yes, existence is fundamentally wrong, but that doesn't mean all suffering is equally necessary. Some suffering results from social structures we can change. We should change them. He supported workers' movements, progressive taxation, education reform. Not because these would create utopia, because they would reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering added to existence's necessary suffering. This social dimension made his philosophy politically useful in unexpected ways. Socialists could embrace his analysis of suffering while rejecting his metaphysical conclusions. You don't need to believe in God's suicide to recognize that poverty causes preventable pain. The philosophy of redemption contains detailed discussions of political economy, labor conditions, educational access. These sections read strangely next to the metaphysical speculation. Cosmic pessimism followed by policy proposals. But Mainländer saw no contradiction. If existence is fundamentally wrong, that makes reducing specific wrongs more important, not less. You can't fix the universe's metaphysical error, but you can fix particular social errors. This dual focus, cosmic and practical, makes the philosophy harder to dismiss. It's not just abstract negativity. It includes concrete analysis of social problems and proposed solutions. The second volume of The Philosophy of Redemption, published posthumously, contains 12 essays on diverse topics: physics, biology, aesthetics, politics. Mainländer was trying to show how his metaphysics explained everything from atomic behavior to artistic creation. Some of these essays are prescient. His discussion of entropy and heat death anticipates later physics. His analysis of aesthetic experience as temporary escape from will echoes Schopenhauer, but adds nuance. Others are dated. His racial theories, common in 19th century Germany, are embarrassing. His gender essentialism reflects period assumptions. These elements can't be excised without damaging the system's coherence, but they limit the philosophy's contemporary relevance. Minna's dedication in preserving these works was extraordinary. After Philipp's death, she became the philosophy's guardian. Publishing the second volume required finding a publisher, editing manuscripts, writing connecting material. This took years. She also collected his letters, wrote biographical material, tried to correct misunderstandings about his work. When critics dismissed him as depressive or insane, she defended his philosophical rigor. When supporters tried to turn him into a cult figure, she emphasized his humanity. Her suicide in 1891 ended this project. The remaining manuscripts were scattered. Some were lost. The philosophy's reception was complicated by both siblings having killed themselves according to its principles. This creates an interpretive problem. Should we read their deaths as validating the philosophy or as evidence of mental illness? Can both be true simultaneously? Modern psychiatry would likely diagnose depression. The family history of suicide, the mental illness in previous generations, the timing of the breakdowns. These suggest psychological factors beyond philosophical conviction. But depression doesn't make your arguments false. It might make you more likely to formulate certain arguments, but that's different from those arguments being wrong. Mainlander's cosmology might be mistaken. His metaphysics might be nonsense. But the mistake or nonsense requires philosophical refutation, not psychiatric diagnosis. The tendency to psychologize away uncomfortable philosophy is itself suspicious. Why do we need to explain Mainlander's pessimism as illness? Why not engage with his arguments? Perhaps because those arguments are threatening. If he's right that existence is fundamentally wrong, that death is preferable to life, then most of what we do is based on false premises. Our projects, relationships, hopes, all of it rests on the unexamined assumption that being is better than non-being. Mainlander forces examination of that assumption, and once examined, it's not obviously true. What is existence for? Why continue it? Why bring new beings into existence? Why prevent death when death ends suffering? These questions don't have easy answers. Most people don't think about them. They assume life's value without justification. Mainlander demands justification. Prove existence is worth continuing. Prove death is worse than life. Prove we're not making a terrible mistake by perpetuating being. The philosophy of redemption isn't just pessimistic, it's accusatory. It suggests we're complicit in unnecessary suffering by refusing to acknowledge reality's true nature. Every child born is another fragment condemned to experience existence's wrongness. Every death prevented is another delay in the universe's rightful return to nothingness. This is why the philosophy generates such strong reactions. It's not just dark or depressing, it's challenging fundamental assumptions about value and meaning that most people never question. The academic reception remained limited. German philosophy, after 1876, moved in different directions. Neo-Kantianism dominated universities. Phenomenology emerged with Husserl. Existentialism developed through Kierkegaard's influence. Mainlander fit none of these movements. Too metaphysical for neo-Kantians, too systematic for existentialists, too pessimistic for everyone. He became a footnote, the philosopher who killed himself after publishing his book, arguing that death is salvation, a cautionary tale about taking ideas too seriously. But footnotes sometimes contain important information that main texts overlook. Mainlander's marginalization might reflect not his philosophy's weakness, but its uncomfortable strength. What if he's right? Not about the details, not about God's suicide necessarily, but about existence's fundamental character. What if being really is worse than non-being? What if consciousness is a cosmic mistake? What if the universe's trajectory toward heat death represents genuine progress toward a better state? These possibilities terrify most people. They threaten everything we think we know about value and meaning. So we dismiss them. We psychologize them away. We call them depressive delusions and move on. But the arguments remain, waiting for anyone brave enough to take them seriously. The modern world has a curious relationship with suffering. We acknowledge it exists, but we insist it's solvable. Cancer research will cure disease. Therapy will heal trauma. Economic growth will eliminate poverty. Technology will fix everything eventually. This optimism isn't just temperament, it's ideology. The belief that progress makes things better, that human effort can overcome any obstacle, that tomorrow will be brighter than today. Mainländer would find this absurd, not because progress is impossible, but because it misses the point. You can cure every disease, eliminate every injustice, perfect every social system. The fundamental wrongness of existence remains untouched. Because the problem isn't that existence contains suffering. The problem is existence itself. This distinction matters enormously. Most pessimism is conditional. Life is bad because of specific problems. Fix those problems and life improves. Mainländer's pessimism is unconditional. Existence is inherently negative. No amount of improvement changes this basic fact. Think about what this means for all our projects and ambitions. You work to build a career. Why? To achieve security, respect, satisfaction. But these are just ways of making existence more bearable. They don't justify existence itself. They're strategies for enduring something that shouldn't be endured in the first place. Or consider relationships. We fall in love, form friendships, build families. These connections give life meaning, we say. But meaning for what purpose? To make existence worth continuing, which assumes existence should continue. Mainländer questions that assumption directly. His philosophy operates at a level most thinking never reaches. We debate how to live. He asks why live at all. We argue about which actions are good. He questions whether any action that perpetuates being can be truly good. We worry about making life better. He suggests life itself is the problem. This creates an interesting paradox. If Mainländer is right, then ethics as commonly understood collapses. Because ethics assumes life is worth living. It provides rules for how to live well. But if being is worse than non-being, then living well is impossible. You're just making the best of a fundamentally bad situation. Yet Mainländer doesn't abandon ethics. He reconstructs it on different foundations. The supreme moral principle becomes recognition that non-being is superior to being. Morality consists of acting consistently with this recognition, which means working toward existence's cessation rather than its perpetuation. This sounds monstrous at first, but follow the logic. If existence is genuinely negative, then ending it is genuinely positive. The moral action is the one that moves reality closer to its rightful state of nothingness. Prolonging existence becomes the immoral choice because it extends unnecessary suffering. Now here's where it gets complicated. Mainländer doesn't advocate mass murder or immediate universal suicide. His ethics are more subtle than that. He recognizes that individual wills must come to this realization themselves. Forced death doesn't achieve true redemption because the will hasn't been genuinely negated. It's just been physically stopped. The process has to be internal. Each person must recognize existence's worthlessness and choose cessation. This can't be imposed. It must emerge from understanding. Which is why Mainländer wrote his book. Not to convince people to kill themselves immediately, but to spread the knowledge that would gradually transform humanity's relationship with existence. He envisioned a future where this awareness becomes universal, where people stop reproducing because they understand that creating new life is creating new suffering, where death is welcomed rather than feared, where humanity collectively moves toward extinction, not from despair, but from genuine philosophical insight. This vision has a strange kind of hope embedded in it. Not hope that things will get better in the conventional sense, but hope that we can collectively recognize reality's true nature and act accordingly. Hope that understanding can triumph over the blind will to live. Hope that redemption is possible through knowledge. Compare this to Buddhist philosophy, which Mainländer admired. Buddhism also recognizes suffering as fundamental, also seeks liberation through cessation of desire. But Buddhism frames this as individual achievement. The enlightened person escapes samsara while the world continues. Mainländer universalizes the project, not just individual liberation, but cosmic redemption, the entire universe moving toward the same endpoint. Every fragment of God's shattered being gradually returning to nothingness. It's apocalyptic in scope, but presented as natural progression rather than catastrophic event. The scientific dimension of his philosophy deserves attention. Mainländer wasn't just making metaphysical claims. He tried to ground his system in natural science as it existed in his time. The universe's movement toward entropy, toward heat death, became evidence for his metaphysics. Physics supported pessimism. Modern cosmology has refined these ideas considerably. We now understand entropy more precisely. We know the universe's ultimate fate involves either heat death or Big Crunch or some other scenario depending on various factors. But the general principle holds. The universe is running down, energy is dissipating, order is dissolving into disorder. For most people, this is depressing trivia. For Mainländer, it's fundamental confirmation. The universe really is moving towards cessation, not because God wills it, because that's what God's suicide set in motion. The expanding universe, the cooling stars, the eventual heat death. All of it is redemption in progress. This framework makes certain problems dissolve. The problem of evil, for instance. Why does God allow suffering? Traditional theodicy twists itself into knots trying to reconcile omnipotent benevolence with observable suffering. Mainländer's answer is simple. God doesn't allow suffering. God is suffering, or was. Now God is fragments experiencing existence's wrongness until they cease. Or take the problem of meaning. If there's no God, how can life have meaning? Existentialists agonize over this. Mainländer sidesteps it. Life doesn't have meaning in the sense of purpose or value. It has direction, towards cessation. That's not meaning as traditionally understood, but it provides orientation. The political implications are harder to pass. Mainländer sympathized with socialism. He believed in social justice and workers' rights. But how does this fit with his pessimism? If existence is worthless, why care about economic inequality? His answer involves the path to redemption. For humanity to collectively recognize existence's negative value, people need certain conditions: education, freedom from desperate poverty, time to think rather than just survive. Social justice isn't valuable in itself, but instrumental to spreading the knowledge that will eventually end existence. This is ruthlessly consequentialist. Help the poor, not because poverty is intrinsically wrong, but because poverty prevents people from achieving the awareness necessary for redemption. Improve conditions not to make life worth living, but to create circumstances where people can recognize life isn't worth living. You can see why this philosophy generates discomfort. It takes positions we think are good and gives them disturbing justifications. Yes, reduce suffering. Not because suffering is bad and happiness good, but because suffering without understanding is worse than suffering with understanding. The goal isn't happiness, it's conscious movement towards cessation. Mainländer's influence on later thinkers is traceable, but often unacknowledged. Sioran, the Romanian philosopher of despair, clearly absorbed Mainlander's insights. Sioran's work is more aphoristic, less systematic, but the fundamental pessimism is similar. Existence as cosmic mistake, birth as catastrophe, death as liberation. Then there's the influence on Nietzsche, which is fascinating because Nietzsche explicitly opposed everything Mainlander represented: the eternal return, the affirmation of life, the will to power. These concepts can be read as direct responses to Mainlander's will to die. Nietzsche needed to defeat Mainlander's arguments to make his own philosophy work. The Übermensch in this reading is the answer to Mainlander's Last Man. Where Mainlander envisions humanity gradually choosing extinction, Nietzsche demands we choose existence ever more fully. Where Mainlander sees redemption in nothingness, Nietzsche finds meaning in eternal recurrence. The philosophical disagreement couldn't be more fundamental, but both agreed on one thing: life as it's commonly lived is a mistake. The difference is what to do about it. Mainlander says, recognize the mistake and correct it through cessation. Nietzsche says, transcend the mistake through radical affirmation. Same diagnosis, opposite prescriptions. Contemporary antinatalism owes something to Mainlander, though most antinatalists probably haven't read him. The argument that bringing children into existence is wrong, that reproduction perpetuates suffering, that the ethical choice is to not create new life. This is Mainlander's position, though he embedded it in a much larger metaphysical system. David Benatar's asymmetry argument, for instance: the presence of pain is bad, the absence of pain is good, the presence of pleasure is good. But the absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone exists to be deprived of it. Therefore, not existing is preferable to existing, because you avoid suffering without losing anything of value. This is Mainlander's logic in contemporary analytical form. The difference is that Benatar doesn't extend this to cosmology. He's making an argument about procreative ethics, not about the universe's fundamental nature. Mainlander goes further. Not just individual non-existence, but universal non-existence as the proper goal of everything. The question remains whether this philosophy is refutable. You can reject the metaphysics. God didn't commit suicide because God never existed. The universe isn't God's corpse. Fine, but does that touch the ethical core? The claim that non-being is preferable to being? That claim doesn't depend on the cosmology. It's a value judgment. Being has negative value. Not being has neutral value. Neutral beats negative. Therefore, not being is preferable. Where's the flaw? You might argue that being has positive value, that existence, consciousness, experience are goods that outweigh any suffering, but this requires proof. Most people simply assume it. They've never seriously considered the alternative. And once you do consider it, the assumption looks shaky. What exactly is so valuable about consciousness? We experience pleasure sometimes, sure, but we also experience pain, boredom, anxiety, disappointment, loss. The pleasure doesn't obviously outweigh the pain. At best, it's a mixed bag. More importantly, the pleasures require continued existence to be experienced, which means continued risk of suffering. The person who never exists never suffers and never misses the pleasures they never experienced. The person who exists suffers and might experience pleasure. Which situation is preferable? Mainlander's answer is clear. Non-existence wins because it avoids all negatives without losing anything real. The pleasures of existence aren't valuable enough to justify the suffering required to experience them. This is where most people's intuitions rebel. Life feels valuable. Consciousness seems precious. The thought of universal extinction is horrifying. But Mainlander would say these reactions are just the will to live asserting itself. Evolution programmed us to fear death and value existence. These feelings don't reflect reality's actual value structure. It's a difficult position to refute without simply asserting the opposite. Yes, life is valuable. Why? Because it is. That's not an argument, that's an intuition. And Mainlander's entire project is questioning whether our intuitions about existence's value are trustworthy. The philosophy remains disturbing because it can't be easily dismissed. You can disagree, but disagreement requires either accepting premises Mainlander rejects or rejecting conclusions that follow logically from shared premises. There's no easy way out, and that's what makes Mainlander important, even if he's wrong. He forces examination of assumptions most people never question. He takes pessimism to its logical conclusion and asks whether we can live with those conclusions. The answer for most people is no, but the question had to be asked. So how does someone respond to this? Not just intellectually, but practically. Because Mainlander wasn't writing for academic debates. He was writing for people struggling to justify their continued existence. The traditional response is to simply affirm life's value. Existence is good. Consciousness is precious. These claims get repeated until they sound like truths rather than assumptions. But Mainlander already anticipated this. He knew people would resist his conclusions. He attributed that resistance to the will to live, the biological drive that keeps organisms functioning despite suffering, which creates a problem. If you disagree with Mainlander because you feel life is valuable, he can say your feelings are programmed by evolution, not reflections of reality. If you agree with him, he can say you're recognizing truth despite your programming. Either way, his system wins. This isn't good philosophy, it's unfalsifiable reasoning, but it's also uncomfortably close to how we actually think about cognitive biases. We recognize that our brains systematically distort reality. Optimism bias makes us overestimate positive outcomes. Availability heuristic makes recent events seem more significant. Confirmation bias makes us seek evidence supporting existing beliefs. Why wouldn't there be a bias toward existence itself? A built-in assumption that being alive is preferable to not being alive. Evolutionary biology suggests exactly this. Organisms with a strong drive to survive and reproduce leave more descendants. Over billions of years, this produces creatures wired to value existence automatically. The feeling that life is worth living isn't a discovered truth. It's a selected trait. Remove that trait and the lineage dies out. Mainlander understood this. He just concluded that our instincts were misleading us. The will to live makes us cling to existence despite suffering. Recognizing this allows us to override the instinct, to choose non-being rationally rather than clinging to being instinctively. But there's a deeper response available, one that doesn't require affirming life's positive value or denying suffering's reality. It questions whether the framework itself makes sense. Mainlander assumes that being and non-being can be compared, that we can meaningfully say one is preferable to the other. But preference requires a subject, someone who prefers. Non-being has no subject. There's no one there to benefit from avoiding suffering. This might seem like wordplay. It's not. The asymmetry between existence and non-existence is fundamental. When you exist, things can be better or worse for you. Pleasure is better than pain. Health is better than sickness. But when you don't exist, there's no you for things to be better or worse for. Non-existence isn't a state you occupy. It's the absence of states entirely. Mainlander would respond that this misses the point. The comparison isn't from the perspective of the non-existent person. It's from our current perspective, evaluating whether coming into existence was good or bad. And his claim is that it was bad, that the suffering existence brings outweighs any goods. Fine, but this requires accepting that we can evaluate existence from outside existence, that there's some neutral standpoint from which being and non-being can be compared. Where is this standpoint? We're embedded in existence. Our evaluations happen from within being. There's no view from nowhere that lets us judge whether the whole enterprise is worthwhile. You might think this saves existence. If we can't judge it from outside, maybe we can't condemn it. But the same logic cuts both ways. We also can't affirm it. The question whether existence is valuable might be unanswerable, not because the answer is difficult, but because the question doesn't make sense from any available perspective. This would make Mainlander's project impossible, but it would also make the opposite project impossible: the cheerful affirmation of life's value. Both require a standpoint we don't have. Both assume we can evaluate existence as a whole, rather than just particular states within existence. There's another angle. Mainlander's ethics depends on his metaphysics: the will to die, the universe as God's corpse, the inevitable march toward nothingness. Strip away the cosmology and what remains? A claim that suffering outweighs pleasure. That consciousness is a burden. That non-being is preferable to being. These claims stand or fall on their own. The metaphysical story about God's suicide is window dressing, and without the metaphysics, the ethics look shakier. Why should we believe suffering always outweighs pleasure? Mainlander's own life suggests otherwise. Those 5 years in Naples he described as the happiest of his life. The 4 months of creative frenzy, writing his philosophy. If existence is uniformly negative, how do we explain these periods of genuine fulfillment? Mainlander would say they're temporary reprieves from suffering, brief interruptions in an otherwise painful existence. But this seems arbitrary. Why not say suffering is the interruption and contentment the baseline? Or better, why not acknowledge that existence contains both without trying to calculate which predominates? The calculation itself might be impossible. Suffering and pleasure aren't quantities that can be measured and compared. They're qualitatively different experiences. Trying to determine whether one outweighs the other is like asking whether blue is heavier than middle C. The question assumes commensurability that doesn't exist. But even granting that comparison is possible, why should suffering count more than pleasure? Mainlander assumes suffering is somehow more real, more significant. But this is a value judgment, not a discovered fact. Someone else might say pleasure is more real because it represents fulfillment rather than lack. Here's where things get genuinely strange, because Mainlander's philosophy, despite its nihilistic conclusions, contains something almost optimistic: the belief that suffering serves a purpose, that the universe is moving toward redemption, that individual deaths contribute to cosmic resolution. This is teleology, purpose written into nature. The universe has a goal, its own dissolution, and we participate in that goal through our deaths. There's meaning here, dark meaning, but meaning nonetheless. Compare this to a truly purposeless universe, one where suffering serves no function, where death accomplishes nothing, where the cycle of existence continues indefinitely without resolution or redemption. Which is worse, Mainlander's vision where suffering leads somewhere, or a vision where it leads nowhere? His philosophy offers cosmic significance to individual extinction. Without that framework, death is just death, meaningless cessation. Not redemption, not contribution to universal goals, just ending. Some people find this genuinely more disturbing than Mainlander's system. At least he provides narrative, a story about where we came from and where we are going. Remove that and you're left with brute existence, followed by brute non-existence, with nothing connecting them to larger purposes. This suggests something crucial about pessimistic philosophy. It's not necessarily more realistic than optimism. It's a different lens, a way of organizing experience that emphasizes certain elements and de-emphasizes others. Mainlander saw suffering everywhere because his framework made suffering central. Someone else, using different lenses, sees beauty, connection, meaning. Neither lens is the truth. Both are interpretations, ways of making sense of existence that highlight different aspects. The question isn't which lens corresponds to reality. The question is which lens we choose to use. But Mainlander would reject this. He wasn't offering an interpretation. He was revealing truth. The universe really is God's corpse. Suffering really does outweigh pleasure. These aren't perspectives. They're facts about reality that most people refuse to acknowledge. And this brings us to the fundamental impasse. How do you argue with someone who claims to have seen through the illusions everyone else accepts? Who attributes disagreement to bias, self-deception, or insufficient courage to face reality? You can't. The position is unfalsifiable. This doesn't mean it's wrong. Unfalsifiable claims can be true. But it means the philosophy has moved beyond argument into something else. Faith, perhaps, or aesthetic preference, or psychological disposition. Mainländer looked at existence and saw decay. Others look at the same existence and see possibility. Who's correct? Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe the questioner assumes a single, objective answer where none exists. Different temperaments produce different philosophies. Mainländer's pessimism might reflect his personal psychology more than universal truth, but recognizing this doesn't diminish the philosophy's power. It just relocates its significance. Instead of asking, is Mainländer right? Ask what his philosophy reveals about the human condition. What does it mean that someone could develop this comprehensive system of cosmic pessimism? What does it say about consciousness that we can question whether consciousness is worthwhile? These questions don't have answers, but they're worth asking. Because Mainländer, whatever his personal demons, touch something real. The possibility that existence might not justify itself, that suffering might outweigh meaning, that the universe might be fundamentally indifferent or hostile to conscious experience. Most people don't spend much time with these thoughts. They live, work, love, die. They don't question whether the whole enterprise is worthwhile. And maybe that's healthy. Maybe constant philosophical scrutiny of existence's value is paralyzing. Maybe Mainländer's obsessive analysis prevented him from simply living. But someone has to ask these questions. Someone has to push philosophy to its darkest conclusions and see what survives. Mainländer did that. He followed pessimism to its endpoint and constructed an entire worldview around suffering, death, and dissolution. The system is comprehensive, internally consistent, and profoundly disturbing. It's also incomplete, because Mainländer's philosophy explains why we should accept death, but not how to live. If non-being is preferable to being, why not commit suicide immediately? His answer involves timing, cosmic process, individual contribution to universal redemption. But these feel like rationalizations, ways of avoiding the obvious implication of his premises. If you genuinely believe non-being is better than being, if you felt this in your bones, you'd end your existence immediately. The fact that most pessimists don't suggest something isn't quite right. Either the philosophy is wrong, or they don't truly believe it. Mainländer himself waited until his book was published. Why? If existence is suffering and non-existence is preferable, why delay? The answer might be that even the most committed pessimist retains some connection to life's value, some sense that certain things matter, publishing your philosophy, contributing to human thought, leaving something behind. These impulses contradict pure pessimism. They suggest that existence, at least some existence, has meaning worth preserving temporarily. Mainländer's contradictions might be the most honest part of his philosophy, because no one actually lives pure pessimism. Not even pessimists. They write books, they form relationships, they care about how their ideas are received. These actions presuppose value, meaning, purpose. The very act of constructing a philosophical system assumes that thought matters, that clarity is worth achieving, that understanding has value. If existence is truly worthless, why bother explaining why? Why not just exit immediately? The delay reveals something crucial. Even the darkest pessimism contains traces of affirmation. Mainländer wanted his work published. He wanted to contribute. He waited until the first volume appeared before ending his life. That waiting period, those final months of feverish productivity, contradict the philosophy's explicit claims. They suggest that even someone convinced of existence's negative value found something worth preserving temporarily. His philosophy, his contribution to human thought, mattered enough to postpone the relief of non-existence. This doesn't invalidate pessimism, it complicates it. It shows that philosophical positions exist alongside psychological realities that don't always align. We can hold beliefs intellectually that we don't fully embody emotionally. We can think existence is worthless while still finding specific projects meaningful. The contradiction might be inevitable. Perhaps it's impossible to fully inhabit pure pessimism while remaining alive. But there's another angle. What if Mainlander's suicide wasn't philosophical consistency, but psychological collapse? His letters from the final months describe exhaustion, depletion, an inability to continue. He'd pushed himself relentlessly. 4 months of creative frenzy to finish the book before military service. Then another burst of productivity after his release, correcting proofs, writing a novella, completing the 2nd volume. All this while battling whatever internal demons drove him. The family history haunts the story. His grandfather's suicide at 33, his brother Daniel's suicide in 1857, his own sister Minna would follow in 1891. This pattern suggests something beyond philosophical conviction. Mental illness runs through the family, like a fault line. Mainlander's pessimism might have been as much symptom as philosophy, the worldview that made intellectual sense of his suffering. Does this origin diminish the philosophy's validity? Not necessarily. Ideas can emerge from psychological distress and still contain truth. Nietzsche developed his most powerful insights while battling illness. Kierkegaard's anxiety shaped his existentialism. Personal suffering doesn't disqualify philosophical conclusions, it might enable them. Sometimes you need to experience darkness to articulate it clearly. But it does mean we should hesitate before treating Mainlander's system as objective reality rather than one possible interpretation shaped by particular psychological and historical circumstances. The philosophy reflects a specific temperament encountering specific conditions. Someone else with different biology, different family history, different experiences might look at the same cosmos and reach opposite conclusions. This brings us to the question of influence. After Mainlander's death, his work largely disappeared. His sister Minna published the 2nd volume in 1886, a collection of philosophical essays expanding on themes from the main work. A few artists and writers encountered the philosophy and were struck by its radical honesty. Alfred Kubin called it the consolation of his life and death. The Japanese writer Akutagawa referenced it repeatedly. Emile Cioran was impressed, but mainstream philosophy largely ignored Mainlander. Too extreme, too disturbing, too honest about conclusions most thinkers preferred to avoid. The system remained obscure for decades, known only to specialists and those drawn to pessimism's darkest expressions. Only recently has scholarship begun seriously engaging with his work, examining how he pushed Schopenhauer's pessimism to conclusions Schopenhauer himself resisted, how he constructed a cosmology that makes the universe itself temporary, how he combined radical pessimism with social concern. The rediscovery matters because Mainlander addresses questions contemporary philosophy still struggles with. If consciousness is the universe becoming aware of itself, is that awareness necessarily good? If evolution produces beings capable of recognizing existence's meaninglessness, has evolution made a mistake? If technological progress enables longer lives and reduced suffering, does that validate existence or just postpone its reckoning? These questions feel more urgent now than in 1876. We've developed the capacity to end human existence entirely. Nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence. For the first time in history, we can actually accomplish what Mainlander's philosophy suggests might be preferable: universal cessation, the final redemption. Should we? Mainlander would say yes. Most people would say no. Who's right? The answer depends on premises you can't prove. Is consciousness inherently valuable? Does suffering outweigh pleasure? Is meaning real or constructed? These are bedrock assumptions, not conclusions from argument. You either see existence as justified, or you don't. Mainlander didn't. His entire philosophical edifice rests on that foundational perception. If you share it, his system makes sense. If you don't, it seems like elaborate rationalization of depression. But even those who reject pessimism can learn from Mainlander, because he forces confrontation with questions usually avoided. Why does existence continue? Why do we create more conscious beings through reproduction? What justifies bringing someone into existence without their consent? These aren't abstract puzzles. They're practical questions with immediate ethical implications. Mainlander demands we answer them, rather than assume existence's value. His political dimension surprises people expecting nihilistic withdrawal. Mainlander cared intensely about social justice. He criticized capitalism's exploitation. He sympathized with workers and the poor. He argued that pessimistic ethics requires creating conditions where everyone can develop awareness of life's true nature. This means education, economic security, freedom from oppression. You can't achieve philosophical clarity while starving or enslaved. This practical concern distinguishes Mainlander from other pessimists who retreat into private salvation. He recognized that individual redemption isn't enough. The system must address collective suffering. His late letters debate whether to continue writing or join the social democratic movement, whether philosophy alone suffices or whether political action is necessary. The question tormented him because both seemed inadequate. Philosophy couldn't change material conditions. Politics couldn't address metaphysical realities. He chose philosophy, or rather, he completed the philosophy and then chose death. The political question remained unresolved. His sister Minna published his addresses to German workers after his suicide, texts outlining how socialist transformation might accelerate humanity's movement toward redemption. But Mainlander himself never acted on these plans. The exhaustion was too complete. What remains is the system, a comprehensive philosophy arguing that existence is God's corpse, consciousness is God's awareness of his self-destruction, and all beings share a fundamental will toward non-existence. The universe is dying, death is salvation, nothingness is the only peace. This is Mainlander's gift to philosophy, a vision so dark it makes other pessimists seem optimistic. A cosmology where entropy isn't just physics, but metaphysics. A ethics where the highest good is hastening existence's end. You don't have to accept it. Most people won't. The philosophy contradicts basic human intuitions about life's value, but you can't ignore the questions it raises. Why does anything exist? Why does consciousness emerge? What justifies the suffering inherent in existence? If you can't answer these questions, Mainlander's position gains strength through your silence. The standard responses feel inadequate. Life creates meaning through relationships, achievements, experiences. But Mainlander already addressed this. Temporary pleasures don't outweigh fundamental suffering. Meaning we create isn't real meaning. It's self-deception, distraction from the void. You're just describing coping mechanisms, not refutations. Religious answers fare no better. God's plan, ultimate purpose, eternal life. Mainlander dismantles these by making God himself the suicide. If even God preferred non-existence to existence, what hope do we have? The cosmology turns theodicy inside out. The problem isn't why God permits evil. It's why God created anything at all. And Mainlander's answer is that God didn't want to. He wanted to stop existing. The universe is his method. So where does this leave us? With a philosophy that can't be definitively refuted, but also can't be fully lived. A system that explains too much and too little simultaneously. Too much because it accounts for suffering, meaninglessness, and cosmic indifference with comprehensive logic. Too little because it can't explain why we keep living, why we care, why we find things beautiful, despite believing them worthless. Mainländer himself embodied this contradiction. He wrote for years about existence's negative value while continuing to exist. He delayed suicide to publish his work. He cared about how his ideas would be received. These actions betray investment in life, even while arguing life has no value. The gap between philosophy and practice reveals something neither the philosophy nor its critics fully address. Perhaps humans simply can't align belief and behaviour completely. Perhaps we're condemned to live as if life matters even when we're convinced it doesn't. This might be the real insight, not that Mainländer was right or wrong about existence's value, but that the question itself might be unanswerable in any final sense. Different people will reach different conclusions based on temperament, experience, biology, circumstance. Some will see existence as gift, others as curse. Neither can prove their position to the other, because the disagreement lies beneath argument. Mainländer saw the curse clearly. He articulated it brilliantly. He built an entire philosophy explaining why existence fails to justify itself. Then he followed his logic to its conclusion. That final act has haunted philosophy ever since, not because it was tragic, though it was, not because it was premature, though it was, because it posed a question that philosophy still hasn't answered. If the most rigorous pessimism leads to suicide, and most pessimists don't commit suicide, what does that tell us? That the philosophy is wrong? That philosophers lack courage? That intellectual positions and lived experience operate in different registers? Maybe all three, maybe none. What's certain is that Mainländer's life and death force us to consider whether philosophy should be livable, whether systems that lead to self-destruction are thereby invalidated, whether intellectual honesty requires following conclusions wherever they lead, even if the endpoint is darkness. These questions don't have comfortable answers. They sit at the intersection of thought and action, belief and consequence. Mainländer walked that intersection and chose the path most philosophy avoids. He thought clearly about existence and concluded it wasn't worth continuing. Then he stopped. The standard interpretation of Mainländer's death treats it as philosophical suicide, a man living out his beliefs with brutal consistency. He argued non-being is preferable to being. He completed his work. He ended his existence. Case closed. But look closer and the clarity dissolves. The letters from those final months don't describe philosophical serenity. They describe someone falling apart. Exhausted, worked out, a completely healthy body, ineffably tired. This isn't the language of someone calmly executing a rational plan. This is breakdown. The family history matters here, not to dismiss the philosophy as mere symptom of illness, but to complicate the simple narrative. His grandfather at 33, his brother Daniel, later his sister Minna. The pattern suggests something beyond individual choice, something inherited, biological, waiting. Does this make the philosophy less true? Not necessarily. Depression might enable certain insights rather than distorting them. Maybe you need to experience existence as burden to articulate clearly why burden is existence's essential character. Maybe Mainländer's psychological state let him see what healthier minds refuse to acknowledge. But it does mean we can't treat his suicide as pure philosophical statement. It was philosophy and psychology and exhaustion and family curse all tangled together inseparably. The act had multiple meanings simultaneously: philosophical consistency, mental collapse, inherited destiny, relief from unbearable weariness. What survived him was the system. 2 volumes totaling over 1,200 pages, a complete metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, physics, politics, everything explained through the lens of cosmic pessimism. God's suicide, the will to die, universal redemption through dissolution. The books sat on shelves. A few people read them. Fewer understood them. Even fewer were convinced. Mainländer remained obscure for decades, not because the philosophy was unclear, but because it was too clear. It articulated conclusions most thinking instinctively avoids. His influence worked indirectly. Nietzsche encountered the work and constructed his entire mature philosophy as response. The eternal return, the will to power, amor fati, these concepts make sense as counter-arguments to positions Mainländer had staked out. You need to defeat Mainländer's pessimism to make such an affirmation viable. Other thinkers absorb the ideas without acknowledgement, the sense that consciousness might be cosmic mistake, that suffering might be intrinsic rather than accidental, that death might be liberation rather than tragedy. These notions circulated through 20th century philosophy, often without attribution to their clearest articulator. The rediscovery came later. Scholars realized that Mainländer had pushed pessimism further than anyone before or since, that his cosmology anticipated certain developments in physics, that his ethics connected individual suffering to social conditions in ways other pessimists ignored, that his work deserved attention not as historical curiosity, but as serious philosophical system. Contemporary antinatalism owes him unacknowledged debt. The argument that creating new life is wrong, that non-existence avoids harm without denying benefit, that the ethical choice is to not reproduce. This is Mainländer's position, stripped of its metaphysical framing. The logic persists even when the cosmology gets rejected. His political dimension remains underexplored. The combination of radical pessimism with commitment to social justice seems contradictory until you understand his reasoning. If existence is fundamentally wrong, that makes reducing specific wrongs more urgent, not less. You can't fix the metaphysical error, but you can address preventable suffering. Justice matters precisely because existence doesn't. What do we make of all this? A man born into a family marked by suicide, who discovered pessimistic philosophy as teenager in Naples, who spent 15 years developing a comprehensive system arguing existence is God's corpse, who published that system and immediately killed himself, who left behind books that most readers found too disturbing to engage seriously, who influenced later philosophy more through absence than presence, through the questions he forced others to confront rather than answers they accepted. The philosophy itself remains unfalsifiable. You can't prove non-being is preferable to being because the claim operates at a level beneath proof. It's a value judgment, an orientation, a fundamental stance toward existence that either resonates or doesn't. Mainländer felt it in his bones. Most people don't. The gap between these positions can't be bridged by argument. But the questions persist. What justifies existence? Why does consciousness emerge? Does suffering outweigh pleasure? Can we evaluate being and non-being from any neutral standpoint? These aren't abstract puzzles. They're live issues for anyone who's ever wondered whether continuing makes sense. Mainländer's gift wasn't answers, it was articulation. He gave precise philosophical form to doubts most people leave vague. He followed premises to conclusions and didn't flinch when those conclusions pointed toward darkness. He built a system that explains everything from cosmic origins to individual psychology through the lens of redemptive dissolution. The system is wrong, or the system is right. Neither claim can be established definitively. What matters is that someone constructed it, that the possibility exists, that consciousness can turn against itself and question its own value with logical rigor. We're still living with these questions. Climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, technologies that could accomplish what Mainländer's philosophy suggests might be preferable. Universal cessation, the final redemption. We have the capacity now. Should we use it? Most people say no instinctively. But the instinct isn't an argument. It's the will to live asserting itself. Mainländer already predicted this response and explained it away. Your resistance proves nothing except that evolution wired you to survive, regardless of whether survival serves any purpose. Breaking free from that programming requires philosophical courage most people lack, or perhaps it requires psychological damage. The distinction might be impossible to draw. Maybe genuine pessimism and mental illness are the same thing viewed from different angles. Mainlander's legacy is this uncertainty, the possibility that consciousness is error, that existence fails to justify itself, that the universe is dying and death is salvation. Most philosophy tries to make sense of life. Mainländer tried to make sense of why life makes no sense. He succeeded too well. The system is comprehensive, rigorous, internally consistent. It explains everything while valuing nothing. It offers redemption through extinction and calls it good news. It turns cosmic history into narrative of divine suicide still unfolding. You don't have to believe it. Most people won't. The philosophy contradicts basic human intuitions too profoundly. But you can't ignore what it reveals about consciousness, that we can question our own existence, that we can construct arguments for why being is worse than non-being, that we can follow logic to conclusions that negate everything we instinctively value. This capacity might be consciousness's fatal flaw, the ability to turn against itself, to recognize its own contingency and meaninglessness. Other animals don't have this problem. They live without questioning whether living makes sense. Only humans achieve the dubious distinction of doubting existence itself. Mainländer made that doubt systematic. He showed that pessimism can be philosophy, not just mood, that arguments exist for why continuing might be mistake, that logic points toward darkness if you're willing to follow honestly. Whether that honesty is wisdom or madness remains unresolved. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the clearest vision of reality's nature is indistinguishable from the deepest despair. Perhaps Mainländer saw truly, and what he saw destroyed him. Or perhaps he was simply ill, a man whose brain chemistry made existence intolerable, and who constructed elaborate philosophical justification for what was ultimately biological dysfunction. The depression came first. The philosophy followed. The system explains the symptom without being caused by it. We can't know. The gap between these interpretations can't be closed. What remains is the work. 2 volumes of systematic philosophy arguing that God killed himself, and we're fragments of his corpse moving toward blessed nothingness. That consciousness is God's final awareness, that death is redemption, that the universe is dying, and this is good. These claims are either the darkest truth philosophy has articulated, or the most elaborate rationalization of depression ever constructed. Possibly both, possibly neither. The uncertainty is the point. Mainländer forces confrontation with questions that don't have comfortable answers. Questions about existence's value, suffering's meaning, death's desirability. Most philosophy avoids these questions or answers them too quickly. Life is valuable because it is. Consciousness is precious because it is. These assertions substitute for argument. Mainländer demanded argument. He constructed one. The argument leads to conclusions most people reject. But rejecting conclusions doesn't dissolve the questions that generated them. So Mainländer persists, not as major figure in philosophy's history, not as founder of a school or movement, but as voice articulating what most thinking refuses to consider. The possibility that existence itself is the problem, that consciousness is curse rather than gift, that non-being is peace and being is wound. He lived this philosophy imperfectly. He delayed death to publish his work. He cared about how ideas would be received. He contemplated political action. These choices suggest investment in existence even while arguing existence has no value. The contradiction might be inevitable. Perhaps philosophy and life operate in different registers. Perhaps we can't fully inhabit pure pessimism while remaining alive. but he tried. He thought clearly about existence and concluded it wasn't worth continuing. He followed that conclusion to its end point.